some questions. What do you?
Oh, he doesn't. Rich
Okay.
is just being a smart ass.
Okay, the date today is 12/6/2021. We're here talking to Basil. Basil. That's the English pronunciation. Basil, give me the last name, Basil.
Basil Thompson.
Basil Thompson. Okay, and give me your birthday, Basil.
November 15th, 1924.
Okay, and we're here at the Evansville Wartime Museum at 7503 Petersburg Road, Evansville, Indiana. And Basil's nice enough to let us interview him today. We've interviewed him about 4 years ago, but we're going to have some questions. We got a couple other people on the board here, and I'll have them introduce them to you. This is George. Say your name.
George Rehnquist.
He's from Princeton.
That's correct.
And he was nice enough. He's known Basil a couple years. Many. So you know all the stories. Now, the other person over here is Tim Mahoney. He's from USI. Tim Mahoney. I got that pronounced right.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay.
That's right.
And so he's going to help ask some questions of Basil today, if I get this camera straight. Now, I'm going to get it back on Basil. Okay? Now, Basil, let's go. And you said when you were born, and we've got a little imitation of a P-47 behind you. But we've got the real one behind me, and we're going to show it to you in a minute or two. We're going to switch your chair so you're by the real baby. Now, the first thing I want to hear is where you were born and where did you live during World War II, and what did you do during World War II?
Well, I was born in Malvern, England. And Malvern is a little town in South Wales.
Okay, South Wales. And how far is that from London?
I'd say about 200 miles, I guess, from London.
200 miles.
Yeah, about that. But you go through many towns and many villages. It's not like here where there's wide open spaces. Everything's condensed.
Yeah.
So it would take you quite a while to get from London to Malvern. Malvern is famous for its sports car production. Morgans are made in Malvern, and I was born within 3 miles of the factory, and I was able to get one later on when I came to the States. So,
Tell us how big the engine is on a Morgan.
yeah. Morgan sports car.
I see. Yeah.
There's not many of them around.
Uh-huh. Now, tell us about 1935 to 39 over there in England and what you thought about things. And then when the war started, tell us what you thought about even before the war. What were your thoughts?
Well, I had a brother born in 1936. He's 12 years younger than me. Still going strong, still driving. And I was at school, at the Dorchester Grammar School. That's where I went to school. A train ride of 8 miles every day, backwards and forwards, from Weymouth, Dorset to Dorchester. Dorchester is a county town. And any town in England that ends in Chester is an old Roman town. And believe it or not, when they dig deep enough in Dorchester, they find Roman coins and vases and everything. Even today, when they dig deep, they're finding Roman relics.
So,
And after school, I went to work in Dorchester. So I still took that train ride backwards and forwards.
what did you do for work at that time when you were a teenager?
Well, my father ran a newspaper in Weymouth called the Dorset Daily Echo, and they had a branch office in Dorchester, and he put me in the branch office. That's where I started my newspaper career.
Well, that's really the history of a civilization, the newspaper. So you were really up on things, being part of a newspaper.
Up on a lot of things, because people, during the war, people used to call in the paper and let us know where a plane had crashed. It could be an Me-109 German, or it could be a Spitfire, or later on, of course, it could be a P-17. But
But tell us about like 37 to 39, what you thought about, because Germany was arming up and they took over Poland immediately, then they took over lots of Europe. Can you tell me what your thoughts were when all that was happening?
Well, of course, Churchill was very much aware that Germany were building up a terrifically powerful military operation. Churchill was trying to warn many of the officials in the British government, but a lot of them didn't want to hear it, and quite a few wanted us to go with Germany against Russia. There was a group there. So the newspaper stories were all about that at the time.
How about the local residents, the people that you lived around? Were they concerned about what was happening?
Yeah.
The Germans?
Speak up louder just so your question.
Yeah. We were. I was at school, and I left school when I was 16 because my dad was having men called up for the war, and I was asked to leave school. We used to go to school on a Saturday in those days for half a day, and I went to school that Saturday, and the master beckoned me and said, "The headmaster wants to see you." So I go in and I wonder, what in the devil have I done now? But I went to see the headmaster, and he said, "Your dad has just called and he wants you to start at the Dorchester office on Monday." So that's how things changed. And I was 16. It was 1940. And
Started working full time for the Dorchester News.
yeah, the Dorset Daily Echo, and I was in, that's where I started. But of course, this was 1940. I was 16 years old in 1940, so there was a Battle of Britain was going on above us. Planes coming over the English Channel, and we were getting bombed, different parts of England, and they pretty well always had to come over Weymouth and over the southern part of England to get to the industrial part of England, like Birmingham and Coventry. So we had a lot of activity.
What type of planes did you see coming over? Or what did you hear? Because you had to report on that.
Yeah, well, about hearing is rather interesting because we could always pick out German planes because they weren't synchronized like the British planes, and they had a warble to them. So whenever we heard planes coming over, and incidentally, Dad, I can see him now looking at his watch, and it was beginning to get dark around 5 or 6 o'clock. He said, "Jerry will be over here in about half an hour." So we were always ready for them to come over, because they only had 90 miles to come from France over the English Channel to get to England. So we had a lot of activity that day.
And then when they would come over, were you scared when they came over? They didn't gonna.
No. As far as teenagers, we enjoyed the excitement of it all. We went to a certain hill near Weymouth, and you could almost forecast when there'd be a dogfight, when the Spitfires were getting up there to meet the ME-109s that were coming over from France.
Did they talk to you much about night blindness and the pilots to be at a disadvantage, the British pilots, the American pilots, when they're fighting the Germans coming at night? Did they ever talk about the night blindness that they would experience?
Yeah, I did hear about that, yes. And when I was in the Air Force, we had something in our diet, I forget what it was. But
Vitamin A.
yeah, but it was for night flying, yeah, to help you at night.
Because it takes your eyes about a half an hour to equilibrate, and in the first part of the war, the Spitfires and some of the American planes would go up, and the Germans could see because their cones and their rods had already accommodated. Takes a half an hour, so the British would a lot of times stay in a dark room or had red glasses on to keep the lights, keep their night vision appropriate.
It's quite possible, but I know we had some here in our diet, in our diet to help us to see at night.
What did you think about Churchill?
Oh, my dad was a Churchill man. So whether I was up on politics in those days or not, my dad, because Churchill was the head of the Navy.
In World War I.
Yeah.
In World War I, he helped with the Navy. He was in charge of a lot, so he understood in war.
Yeah, before he became prime minister. But Dad was a real Churchill man. Of course, I've always been one. And George is definitely one.
When when Dunkirk occurred, what did your family think about Dunkirk? When Dunkirk happened, you know, Churchill said at that time, which helped the United States arm themselves, he said, if you can't get men and machines to the land, you're not going to win this war. And he was a big leader in England.
Yeah, I remember Dunkirk very, very well. It was 1940, and there was 300,000 British troops trapped in Dunkirk. The Germans were encircling them, and we were trying to get them out. And from our town, from our port, from our harbor, we sent little ships of all types to pick the men up, to bring them over to England. It was a big, big deal in 1940. And personally, I remember a flotilla of men walking along the Preston Beach Road near our town, and they were all tank men. They had leather jackets and goggles and stuff. They had been brought from France over to England by all these little ships. We even sent our paddle steamers over to pick them up. And we used paddle steamers because it was a seaside resort. We took people around all the different ports. But during the war, when they needed every ship available to bring back those men, they sent everything over.
12 to 14 days. It was a miracle to get them back, and it was even private. It wasn't all the big ships, and it was very hard to get them on the ships because of the seas mean.
In fact, when I went back to England recently in 2017, I was on one of the little ships. They had restored it and taking people around Portland Harbor, and Portland was the naval base. That was another thing that was close to Weymouth.
And that ship you were on wasn't very seaworthy either.
No, and the Germans were firing at them too.
Yes.
I mean, the ship that I was on had bullet holes in it, and they had left the bullet holes there. Oh, it was amazing evacuation, Dunkirk. There's been books and movies made.
Very nostalgic. Probably some of your neighborhood's brothers and older people than you had been saved with Dunkirk, because 300,000+ men were saved during that time, where Hitler could have pushed them all in the ocean. He could have knocked them off, but for some reason he didn't.
Well, it was really, the talk was that Hitler had a soft spot for England, strangely enough. He could have done a lot more, but for some reason he didn't. And as I told you, a lot of the fellas in Parliament and the British government wanted to go with Germany against Russia. So it was a strange situation there. But Churchill wouldn't have anything to do with that. I mean, so there was no way Churchill would have gone along with that.
But there was probably a 40-60 vote in Parliament, or a 70-30 of that sentiment.
I don't know what it was, but...
Yeah.
Basil, did England ever think they were going to lose the war?
No, that's another thing. We could never see the Germans in our town or over in England. Although in 1940, of course, before the Americans came over, we were on our own. And I mean, we could have been invaded. We had great big tank stops all along the seafront, out in the bay, in Weymouth Bay. We had the defense booms, which are steel rods all welded together. And Dad always said, it's not going to stop them, but it'll slow them down. But we were ready to be invaded.
Can you talk a little bit about the British Navy and the British Air Force, how they were so good in defending your island?
Yeah, well, Portland was a naval base right near our town. So,
What kind of ships did you have there at Portland?
oh, we had the Royal Oak and the Hood and all those great big battleships, yeah.
How about the Air Force? You were in the Air Force for a while. Can you talk about the Spitfire and how it could defend it against the Messerschmitt?
Yeah, well, I can tell you a bit about that. While I was at school, we could join either the ATC, Aircraft Training
Command.
ATC, if you wanted to go in the Air Force when your papers came. We're all waiting for our papers to come, to go, you know. And we had our own uniform and every Air Training Corps, an Air Training Corps. And if you wanted to go in the Army, OTC, Officers Training Corps. Well, of course, I went in the ATC, and on weekends, we had a fighter station near our town called Warmwell, and that's where all the action was. We sent the planes up to meet the enemy and we were there. We were there on Friday night, Saturday, and came back Sunday, mingling with all the fighter pilots, young guys, 22 years old, mingling with them, talking with them, eating with them, watching them ride their cycles across the field to their little huts where they had to stay, waiting for that phone call telling us that a squadron of ME-109s are heading our way. But we had to get up there, so we had to know ahead of time. And
Basil, you used to visit crash sites when the Messerschmitts were shot down.
As boys, we did. And as I said, being as my dad ran the local paper, people used to call in, so I knew where all the crashes were. And I told my friends, and there was about 4 or 5 Dorchester Grammar School boys, and we just wanted souvenirs from these planes. So
Did you have some interesting friends that liked to go there in particular?
Oh, yeah. Oh, many stories about that. Because when a plane crashed, the Army would get there pretty quick to see if there was any new developments from Germany on those planes. After that, if they didn't find it, they'd leave it. And the next day and days after, we'd be on our bicycles going to the crash sites. I remember cutting a cross off a Ju-87. That is a German dive bomber with fixed undercarriage, and it had crashed in a farm. And Millar, my friend, and I went out there, and I cut the cross off with a can opener all the way around. And it was it's a souvenir which George would have loved. It had bullet holes in it and oil on it, and it was a German cross.
Once, when we were talking about...
And we bring these things home, and my dad said, "You're not bringing that into the house." You know, we propeller blades and stuff, parts of engines, and my friend got a tail wheel, and so in the press room, in his press room, there was a little cubby hole down there, and I had all my parts there. He wouldn't let them come into the house. So yeah, we went to many, many crashes. Another friend of mine took out the whole control, the joystick and all the controls. And the Germans, like the Americans would have Betty Graber or Rita Hayworth imprinted on their B-17 flying forces. The German says cockatoo. It was yellow, black, and red, a cockatoo. And my friend cut that out.
Basil, when you were in school and there was a potential raid, what would happen? What would you do in school?
Oh yeah, well at school the sirens would sound and we'd have to get out of our classroom, go down the field and go into our air raid shelters, which we had dug ourselves around the outside of the playing field. We had dug our own trenches, about 6 feet deep, and then a corrugated piece of iron across that, and then earth on top of that. So it was a good, safe place to live. But, and it was narrow and kind of interesting.
How many times a week did you have to go out of school?
Oh, many, many times.
Did your friends sometimes play tricks on you in school?
We played tricks on the teacher, I'll tell you that, because we had a classroom separate from the school. And I remember whenever we were in that classroom, my friend Miller sat on the back row and he would get his shoulders and bang the wall and it would sound just like a raid coming. It sounded like we were going to be bombed, and it said, "Sir, they're flying into Dorchester." So we get out of our classroom, and we were free for another day. So we have to go down into that trench. So we played a lot of tricks. But that way, and another thing, and I can see this now, one of the guys, there's always some smart guy, we were down in the trenches, it was 6 foot deep, and there were little roots down there, and you could light them, and they would stay aflame. I don't know what they'd be, but a lot of little roots, so we'd have light down there from these roots.
Were the girls scared or the boys not scared in your class?
It was a boys' school. There were no girls.
I see. Huh.
But nobody was scared, and we knew darn well the Germans would never get into England. So that was that.
Where'd you get that confidence? Did Churchill instill that confidence in people? Where did that come?
Yeah, the radio. We huddled around the radio in the evening. And my dad used to say, Churchill kind of slur his words now and again, and Dad said, "Oh, he's had a few tonight," because he had a brandy, you know, pretty handy when he was making a radio broadcast. And Dad said, "Oh, he's had a few tonight." He was telling us about Coventry being bombed and stuff like that.
How often did he speak?
How often did Churchill speak?
Every now and again.
Once a week?
I mean, no, maybe once a month, and it wasn't on a definite schedule. It's if something was happening, he would get on the. And that famous speech, of course, we heard that, and I remember hearing that. But no television, of course. It was all around the radio.
Yeah.
Basil, did you ever have a chance to see Eisenhower at all?
Oh yes, I did in Weymouth. Yeah. When the Americans came to our town, it was great.
What year was that about?
42.
Okay. And they came and tell us about just them and also Eisenhower.
Maybe late 41, but yeah, nice little hometown, Weymouth, seaside resort. People came from the north of England down to get the sea and the beach and the sun. Then the Americans came. They took over. All the equipment was amazing, for one thing. Great big crates with Europe written across it. And every playground and every church ground or any parking lot were full of these crates, American crates. And then, of course, they had the half tracks and the jeeps and everything else, and tanks, and out around Dorset, which was a very pretty county, camouflage nets over pretty well everything to keep them from being spotted from the air.
How'd they get them in? Through the port of Portsmouth and then put them on a train or a truck to bring them up to you, or drive them themselves?
What was that?
How did all that Army equipment get up to your town from the Portsmouth or somewhere else?
Oh, on the road.
But it come in through Portsmouth on a ship, probably.
Oh yes, and unload and come. There were little villages around our town where all the Americans were billeted. They loved our pubs, and they loved our girls. It was a different life.
Yes.
But at least we had somebody with us that, I mean, we could have been invaded if the Americans hadn't come. I mean, I don't know what would have happened. But when they got here, and the American military police had Harley-Davidson bikes, and their helmets were white, and we called them snowdrops. And they would even control the traffic in our town. We had a center of town with quite a few roads verging in, and instead of the regular bobby, the British police would put his hand up like this. And the Americans had a whistle and a little dance and put on a show. And at lunchtime, when we all came out of our offices, there'd be a crowd of people just watching the American military snowdrop directing traffic, because he'd do it in a certain way which we'd never seen before. So little things like that, you know.
Basil, did you think the Americans were kind of a show-off when they were there?
Oh yeah, well, that they were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. That was the general thing about it.
What was the most impressive thing about the Americans that you remember the most?
Very, very generous. I mean, chewing gum. And Dad had to be with American Army chiefs in his office because everything had to be censored. And it was up to my dad to make sure nothing got in the paper, but that was see where troops were, or signposts were pulled down. I mean, lots of things like that. And when ever he had a group of military guys in his office, I go down there, and right away was the smell of cigars. They were all smoking cigars, and they were giving Dad cigars. And when they saw me, I'd get chewing gum. I mean,
Juicy fruit? What kind of chewing gum did you get?
I remember the name, actually, Juicy Fruit. Yeah, I remember the name.
Yeah.
Because I particularly like Juicy Fruit. And the girls got stockings, of course.
Yeah.
But we had one or two GIs visit us for tea. We lived most of the war in a private hotel on the seafront. And the reason we were there, Dad didn't think it was wise to be in the flat above the newspaper office, because it was downtown, it was near the town bridge, it was near a torpedo works, and it was near Portland Naval Base. So he said we should get out of town. So we stayed at different hotels during the war along the seafront. But it was kind of interesting going back in even this latest trip on 27 to look up and see the hotel where we were, with a veranda where we could look down at all the American troops going along our promenade to the docks to leave for Normandy.
Basil, every once in a while, you and your friend would go into London.
whether there was a war or not, or whether we were being blitzed, my friend Millar and I would take a train from Weymouth to Waterloo. Weymouth to Waterloo. Waterloo was London. And there was a certain movie theatre there that had the very latest films and different films. What was the name of it, George? I shouldn't.
I'm not sure I remember. Basil, you would,
But anyway, we would leave Weymouth and we'd arrive in London, and maybe there'd been a blitz the night before. It didn't bother us a bit. And London's so big, I mean, you wouldn't suddenly see damage. There was, even after a blitz and places burnt to the ground, I mean, just arriving into London, you wouldn't see it right away. But different parts of London have been bombed. Because you see, when the Battle of Britain, we did win the Battle of Britain, the Brits did. And Goring decided there were too many German planes being shot down that he gave up the Battle of Britain and started the Blitz of London. And that's where all the bombing took place. People were in the underground shelters.
Basil, every once in a while you would see some young ladies in London. You want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, when the Americans arrived, we went to London quite a bit to observe the Americans. And we loved the idea that they got to know all the girls. And we would wait for a while and then talk to the girls and say, what did they say? What are you going to do? I mean, it was a different life.
Yeah.
And in Piccadilly Circus, I mean, it wasn't unusual to see knee-jerkers against the wall. And we got a kick out of that. The Americans, I mean, they were in Piccadilly and they were with our girl. So my friend Don and I, we were always anxious to find out what kind of a routine the Americans had with the girls. So I remember a couple of girls we got hold of, and we took them to the pub, and they told us about the Americans that they'd met, etc.
Yeah.
And they were prostitutes, but we weren't interested in that part. We were interested in how the Americans were treated.
Yeah.
A different life.
Yeah. I'm just going to change. Tell us about, were you ever in any bombings when London was happening?
Oh, yes.
Can you tell us about what it was like there?
These stories are interesting, and even me talking about them now, I'm interested. We look at History Channel and all these things, and we look back on life, and it's amazing what we went through and what we did. But we were living it. It was happening. And as I said, my dad had a premonition that we should move out of downtown. Well, on April the 2nd, 1942, our place was bombed. The newspaper was bombed.
And how many days had you been gone? About a year? How many days after you left that newspaper in your house there, when did it get bombed? A year later?
We were living on the front in different hotels. Well, it was the night of 1942, April the 2nd, 1942, which happened to be a Thursday right before Good Friday. And in England, they don't publish a paper on Good Friday or Christmas Day. They've never published a paper. So there was a book written, and my dad was mentioned in there as being the manager of the doors there, and having a premonition. And the fact that we didn't lose a day's publication, the place was completely destroyed. But the fact that we didn't bring a paper out on that day, we had already made arrangements at different parts of the newspaper industry would help us. So that Friday didn't have a paper. Saturday we came out with 4 pages, just a sheet doubled up. Four pages, but we did come out with the Dorset Daily Echo.
Heck of a feat.
And he was really praised for that, to get everything, you know. And that was an amazing night, because we were at the hotel on the veranda when our place was bombed downtown. And it was just rumor that, the Echo office has been hit. The telephone office has been hit, which was close together. But then, of course, Dad had to get in touch with the southern newspapers to let them know what had happened. And there was no telephones in Weymouth. We had to make the trip to Dorchester, to the office where I was now manager there. I had the key, and my dad had to make the phone call from there to Southampton to let them know that our place was bombed. I was right there. I mean, when he was on the phone in the middle of the night, telling what happened. Southampton, where our papers were printed, had a 1,000 bomber raid, and they were cut out too. So the Southern Daily Echo was printed in Bournemouth, and now the Dorset Daily Echo was printed in Bournemouth. So Bournemouth had all papers, all 3 papers to print. I mean, it's amazing what we went through.
Do you think they intentionally bombed your newspaper office, or were they hunting?
No, there was a story about that too. The newspaper office,
Skylight. Skylight, Basil.
Yeah, the press works, and the rotary press and all had a skylight, so that there's plenty of light coming in. And there was a moon that night, and we think the moon shining on that on the glass pointed out that it was something as a that's what we thought. We don't know, but we know it was a Heinkel 111 that did it. And when they came to Evansville that time, I thought, well, this is a plane that bombed us in England. Wow. A Heinkel 111. What a premonition of my dad's that was, that we shouldn't stay downtown. We could stay in a hotel along the seafront.
You wouldn't be here now if he didn't have that.
It was a big decision, but it was part of everyday life. That's what we did that day. We decided to get away from downtown, and down on April the 2nd, 42, we were bombed.
Did you miss all your friends?
I wouldn't say that we would have been killed, because it was mostly on the newspaper rotary plant and the reels of paper that were stored. But our flat, do you know, drawers in sideboards were opened, the stuff out, and they closed again with blast.
Wow.
And at the back of our building, there was a pub, and there was a guy blown up the chimney of the pub. I mean, it was just happening at that particular time. But talking about it, I mean, it's fantastic that it actually happened. So,
Basil,
a house at the back of us, the whole house was down except one wall.
Yeah.
And the chimney went from the ground floor up to about three floors. But just the chimney was left. And on the top floor, there was a flower vase still there with a flower in it. And everybody was looking up the following day. The whole place had come down except for that, what do they call it?
Chimney or the wall, the concrete wall.
Sign. But anyway, the vase and the flower was still there. And the whole place had gone, and our printing plant had gone.
Basil, tell us a little bit about your RAF experiences when you were in the RAF.
Oh yeah, well of course I was in the ATC, and so when my papers came, now here's another thing. My dad deferred me, and he was in a position to defer me. I wanted to get in the Air Force. I wanted to be a fighter pilot, and I was a bit annoyed, but he decided that he'd been in World War I, and he wasn't too intent on his son fighting the Germans, but as far as I was concerned, I wanted to do it. But he deferred me, and when he deferred me, which means I could have gone quite a few months earlier than I did, which may, in another fact, save my life, because being an air gunner in the war, and the ME-109s trained on tail gunners. There were not many tail gunners left. But being as I was delayed, and then I had what they call a cooked round, which means a round blew up in my turret, and I was on rehab for quite a few months. So there was quite a few months there where I could have been in combat, but I wasn't. So you could look at it both ways.
What was your training like before you went to combat, Basil?
So it was very, very interesting. Browning machine guns mostly, and a lot of marching and physical fitness, and aircraft wreck, where they showed you different airplanes. You had to pick them out.
The silhouettes.
Yeah.
Yeah, behind you on the Hoosier Spirit there, those are Browning automatics. They're 50 caliber Browning automatics. They're 12 millimeter guns, but there's a very common gun made by John Moses Browning,
there
Utah.
were Brownings in the Spitfire. There was 8. There was 4 in each wing of the Spitfire and Hurricanes.
And did they the same caliber, about 50 caliber?
Yeah, about that. Yeah, and when we went to the fighter stations and remember we spent weekends at the fighter stations right in the middle of the Battle of Britain, 1940, when these young guys were up there fighting. I mean, changed the whole. It changed Goring's mind. He quit the Battle of Britain and blitzed London. So we were right in the middle of it as young boys, really. I mean, 16 years old, and we were mingling with the pilots who were in little cabins with a stove in the middle, an ordinary stove which kept the place warm, but they were only little huts.
When you trained...
and the guy would point to a bed which was empty. The night before, there'd be a pilot there, and he'd be shot down. He was no longer with us. Well, all kinds of things like that. But as boys, as teenagers, I mean, that was what we were doing on that particular day, and doing that particular thing. Nothing great about it. We were at war, and Germany was about to invade us, and that's that. And it didn't bother us one bit. We were more interested in souvenirs from the crashed plane. It's crazy to think about it, but we were.
When you trained over there when you were in training, you said you trained with the Browning automatics.
Yeah.
Tell us what the training was like and how far would you have to walk, and did you have any winter training or any cold weather training of any kind?
No, I don't remember too. I mean, I don't remember that part of it. I remember the machine guns and rattling them off, and being in charge of a machine gun and rarely pulling the trigger and holding it there too long where I got a cooked round. I mean, it was my fault really. It got too hot and it blew up in front. And it's a confined space, you know, in those turrets. So, but I went into rehab after that, and it delayed me getting into combat. We'll put it that way.
Probably 6 months. 6 months your first delay, and then after you were hurt, another 6 months. You pushed it back 6 to 8 months, which probably is why you're living now. You would have been up there and maybe not be living.
I have always thought that, maybe because to be a tail gunner in a Wellington bomber, to tell you the truth, we had one or two at our fighter station, and I talked to some of the guys that had been there quite a few months, and they said sometimes when a Wellington came back, it would be in one piece except for the tail gunner, and we'd have to hose them out. That's what he said, we had to hose them out. ME-109 had cannons, not just machine guns, and they wanted to silence that man right away. So that's why they wanted air gunners and not so many fighter pilots.
Basil, you were
Although I did remuster, you can remuster, but then the war ended, so.
You were a tail gunner in a Wellington? Is that where you were training?
Well, I would have become one, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you ever fly in a Wellington?
No, I don't think I actually flew out. I was in trainer planes.
Okay.
But
you were training to eventually get into.
Oh yeah, because it was a famous bomber, the Wellington. They were made at Brooklyn Race Course, you know.
I do know.
In fact, when I visited Brooklyn's, I met that bouncing bomb fella. Right. What was his name? He invented the bouncing bomb.
Yeah.
Well, he happened to be at Brooklyn's that day, and that's where the Wellingtons were, and they had a replica of the bouncing bomb.
Barnes.
Yeah.
Barnes.
And the bouncing bomb was to bomb the dams in Germany. And they couldn't directly bomb them for some reason. But this guy invented a bounce, it bounced and then it hit the dam and flooded the whole area, factories and all, which delayed the war.
Called
Great big thing that, yeah. And they were practicing at Weymouth and close to Weymouth before they developed that bouncing bomb. It was developed right in our area. So much happened around our area. Because, you know, it was France here, English Channel, and Weymouth, and we were there.
the Americans, the plane behind you used what you call a skip bomb, and Alan Sanderson, who's a pilot on that type of plane, is going to be here tomorrow, but he talks a lot about the effectiveness of a skip bomb. Now, your bigger plane had bigger bombs, but this plane behind you could hold 500-pound bombs, and skip bomb is very effective. And in New Jersey and the United States, we trained pilots in this type of plane just to do skip bombing. It was probably, a lot of it was created there in Weymouth or down where you were. And trained, and a lot of people trained there.
Well, they called it the bouncing bomb.
Bouncing bomb.
And do you know how he invented it himself? His daughter was throwing stones in the lake, and they were bouncing. That's where he got the idea.
Did they detonate that with a timer or?
Oh, yes.
The timer.
It bounced, and then when it hit the dam, but for some reason they couldn't just drop a bomb on it. They had to fly very low and release the bomb, and it would bounce. And it did its job. It flooded the whole area and the factory and just delayed the war.
Who was the inventor of that bomb? You said that the daughter gave him the
The
inspiration.
Bonds.
The bonds.
Yeah. Bonds.
Barnes. Barnes.
Yeah. Bonds. And I actually met him at Brooklyn. Because he happened to be there on that day.
Did your plane drop those bounce bombs? Did your plane, the plane you were training for,
No, Lancasters were used.
that's a smaller plane?
Yeah, and they sent over 18. Think about that.
Wow.
And many of them were shot down. Oh yeah, there's a lot of guys killed that particular night.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a concentrated attack, and they did achieve what they wanted, but at great cost.
Didn't they have the Spitfires escorting them to defend them?
I don't know about that. They could have done.
Yeah.
Basil, when you think about the war and you think about the Battle of Britain, what single memory keeps coming back to your mind all the time?
Well, great. All our activity as teenagers. I mean, on our bikes going to places and big. But the actual war itself, I was stationed at different places, 4 different places in England, and I can remember different things.
But the excitement when you were a young boy really sticks in your mind.
Well, one of the things that really hit me was the fact we had the flat above the newspaper office, and Dad only had to come out of his office, walk some stairs, and he was in his flat. And I remember one day, now I do remember this, they're putting sandbags around the king's statue. The king's statue.
Wow.
He was coming up the stairs. This was before we'd actually declared war. They're putting sandbags around the king's statue. Because always in the middle of a British town there's some kind of statue. And we have the Victoria King's statue. And I remember him coming up the stairs and saying, they're putting sandbags around the King's statue. I do remember that very, very well.
That meant something to you.
Oh yeah, I mean, that was big. I mean, before we got into anything